So I want to put a disclaimer in the beginning of this video that I put in my early Christian Schisms video, which should be uploaded exactly at the same time as this, at the exact same minute, that I am a Christian. I fall under, the denomination I fall under is Pentecostal, Apostolic Pentecostal, and some of my religious journey is that I was baptized in the Catholic faith. My grandparents were once Catholic, and eventually, despite being, baptized and going to Catholic church, I also went to a private Christian school before I went to public school, and this Christian school wasn't Catholic. It was a standard Trinitarian believing Christian faith. And eventually I stopped going to church, Catholic church, and Christian school around third grade and onward when I moved to public school. And eventually it wasn't around until the year, but it was around when I was 11 or 12, I went back to the standard Christian denomination, Trinitarian believing, denomination. And then when I was around 13, I fell into Pentecostalism, Apostolic Pentecostalism, and our doctrine is that, we believe in the oneness of Christ. We don't follow the Trinity like many other denominations. We believe in, oneness. That's our doctrine. The oneness of Jesus Christ, who is God, and and we believe in the idea of Acts 2:38 being kind of the blueprint for salvation. Being repenting, being baptized in the name of Jesus, not in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, just the name of Jesus, which is an important aspect to it, and receiving the Holy Ghost, and that's evident by speaking in tongues. And I'm letting you all know this because when I'm going to be giving my thoughts or opinions, I want you to know that I'm giving it through the perspective of a Pentecostal, and obviously it will conflate if you're not Pentecostal with your doctrine or your ideas. But I feel like I really should put this disclaimer on because, this might save... You might understand where I'm coming from, and it might save us some arguments. Hopefully. Probably not, but yeah, I also want to say that I have my original channel. Believe it or not, EDJ is my second channel that I created. My first channel, as you can see from the links next to me, or rather the information of my socials, I have another YouTube channel called Edwin de Jesus. It was my original channel, made almost 9 years ago, and in that channel I talk about Christianity, I talk about theology, sort of teaching it, and I prefer to keep it there. This channel was made to be a secular historical reaction channel, but again, I was recommended these two Christian theological Christian videos, so I'm going to cover it. But I want to say to please not ever recommend to me any more Christian or theological videos on this channel. If you want to hear me talk about it, you can go to my other one and I'll react to anything relating to Christianity on that one. But on this channel, I'm only doing this once. After today, I'm never covering theology or Christianity, or at least talking about it as in-depth as I've done in these two videos. So yes, that's my favor and my request that I ask to you guys. Please don't recommend to me anymore, because I don't know how this is gonna do. This will either do well, or this will probably be some of the most controversial videos on this channel. Probably, I guess we'll see, but either way. With that said, yeah, we should probably get to it, huh? So without any further ado, we're gonna watch Kings and Generals, The Great Schism, the bitter rivalry between Greek and Latin Christianity. Oh, also, I just want to mention that I went to Bible college, under the, Pentecostal aspect. I have my bachelor's in theology, so, I have studied it, but again, I need to mention that this is through a Pentecostal perspective, so it's gonna conflate with other denominations. I also have my bachelor's in English that I got this summer, so, I'm done with both secular and Bible college. So yeah, I just want to briefly mention that, because I'm not sure if I mentioned that in the other video, but,
Throughout the High Middle Ages, Christian civilization was notoriously divided. In one camp was the Catholic West, where the Pope in Rome reigned spiritually supreme. In the other, the Orthodox East, dominated by the Holy Patriarch of Constantinople. In this video, we will explain how the eastern and western halves of the Christian world drifted apart from one another and ultimately became two of the most bitter rivals of the medieval world. In the year 285 AD, the Roman Empire stretched from northern England to the Upper Nile. The Imperium was becoming too big to rule, and the crisis of the 3rd century had nearly seen it buckle under its own weight. As a response, Emperor Diocletian made the fateful decision to split the empire into administrative halves. It was a divide made on cultural lines, for the Western Roman Empire was comprised of predominantly Latin-speaking populations, while in the Eastern Roman Empire, known posthumously as the Byzantine Empire, Classical Greek was the language of prestige. Meanwhile, a young religion born in Judea was rapidly spreading throughout the Mediterranean. While the early Christian movement endured wanton oppression at the hands of various Roman emperors, especially Diocletian, their fortunes changed when Constantine the Great arose as emperor.
Yeah, so you can see my early Christian, Schisms video by Extra History, which came out exactly the same time as you're watching this video. They came out in a pair. I released them both at the same time, where I talk plenty about Constantine and about his rise. So, I'm gonna be a little more silent about it in this video.
Both East and West, and legalized their faith. Christianity quickly supplanted the pagan gods of old, and became the dominant religion of the empire. By the 4th century, the 4 most important Christian churches existed in Antioch, Alexandria, the old capital of the West in Rome, and the shining new capital of the East, Constantinople. In 476, after decades of decline, the Western Roman Empire fell, not with a bang, but a whimper. Presiding over its corpse was a panoply of Germanic tribes, long considered by the Romans to be the barbaric bogeymen beyond the borders of civilization. These tribes settled into their newly conquered lands with relative ease, adopting the Christian faith and the Latin language of their subjects. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire remained wholly intact, while their capital in Constantinople became a hub of classical culture and education. Not only did they now consider themselves to be the sole heirs of the Roman Empire, they saw it as their burden to reunify the lost territories by retaking the West from barbarian hands.
It always kind of amazed me when people say there are some people, and I know it's gonna sound wild to some of us, but have claimed that the Byzantines, are not the Roman Empire, or at least use the term, not in the discussion of successors, which is wild to me. I know, I've read some pretty, things that I don't agree with, but it's literally, it is Rome. It's interesting, even the word it is the continuation, right? What's the other word people use? I can't think of it at the moment, but it's almost the true successor. I'm it is just the other part, though. It's it's still Rome, successor is kind of the follow-up. I just feel only one part of it, kind of broke off, it's still here. So even that word's like always been weird to me. I mean, it's not like incorrect. It's just like it is still just Rome, you know. And I think there sometimes I call it in these videos the Byzantine era of Rome, you know, just to kind of know what we're talking about. But it is just Rome, you know what I mean? Or like when people are claiming to be the true successor of Rome in the West, and then it's like the Byzantines are still around. Like what? You know what I mean? It's like technically the Roman Empire never fell, guys. It's like chilling right here in the East. At least like half of it is still, you know. Like it's just an interesting thing to me, you know. The whole discussion, but yeah, it is just Rome. And yeah, I kind of want to kind of praise the Byzantine era of Rome. As I've learned about Roman history, it's funny because when I first started this channel, I wasn't, you know, I was mainly, you know, aware of Rome when it was whole, the Republic through the early Empire, but in this channel, through all the videos of Rome I've seen through the Byzantine era, I have to say that the Byzantine era of Rome, when it was just the East, is actually now my favorite era of the Romans, because it's in this era where they are the ultimate underdogs. Like, you could say, like, early Rome definitely was, and, you know, and whatnot, but like I don't know, like I feel like this is their most underdog era, where literally the world, East and West, is against them, and they're just fighting to survive, and I kind of can't help but like root for them. I don't know, the Byzantine era of Rome is my favorite era of Rome now, you know, and I owe it to all the videos that we've seen about it, you know.
In this, Emperor Justinian was the most successful, as his conquests saw most.
Can't ignore my boy Belisarius though. I like Justinian. I don't like the way he treated Belisarius though. That's kind of a sore point with me that I still hold against Justinian. After all this time, I'm still kind of upset at him for the way Belisarius was treated. But overall, I do love both Justinian and, of course, the great Belisarius.
Of the former Western Empire, including all of Italy, brought under his rule. Byzantine supremacy was not to last, as in the 7th century, an unexpected threat arose out of the southern deserts. The Arabs of the Rashidun Caliphate, embodying a new religion, Islam, swallowed up the southern...
And we've covered the rise of in the early Muslim expansion on this channel, and the rise of the Ottomans. Both have to do with the Byzantines getting completely wrecked by the new rising force of Islam, so feel free to check that out, and you know, because we have already covered those series to completion at this point.
And half of the Mediterranean. This had a polarizing effect upon Christendom, for Antioch and Alexandria were now in Muslim hands. There were now only two major centers of Christianity, one in Rome and one in Constantinople, making it inevitable that the two would eventually feud over which one was the ultimate ecclesiastical authority in Christendom. While the Holy Patriarch in Constantinople was a massively influential man, formally speaking, the Bishop of Rome, otherwise known as the Pope, was the highest power in the Christian world.
Yeah, you know, the thing is, especially when I was Catholic, is that there's the idea and belief that Peter's, you know, the disciple Peter of Jesus Christ is the first pope. He's regarded as the first pope, and you know, and it kind of a big idea is that in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, there's the famous talk between, you know, where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And then they come up with, you know, various things that have been told to them, but Peter himself, you know, has the very famous response, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," and Jesus says, you know, "Upon this rock I will build my church." And again, like, you know, oftentimes, this is another denominational thing that will be seen differently by people. sometimes it's like upon Peter himself, which Peter, the name means rock. His name was Simon, but it was changed to Peter in the Bible, and that the church was built on the rock Peter. In my denomination, Pentecostal, we don't really believe in that. We believe that the rock that Jesus was talking about upon the foundation he would build his church was the revelation that Peter had about Christ being the Son of the living God, because even Jesus himself said, flesh did not reveal this, but something on high, God. And again, that's a big thing, and even people to this day debate that. Like, some would say, actually, Edwin, you're wrong. Again, this is another one, and again, I need to keep prefacing this because I'm only speaking with you under the Pentecostal perspective. Obviously, if you're Catholic or not Pentecostal, you won't agree with me, and that's fine. But again, that's just the thing about these doctrines. They're different, and even ideas like this are highly debated. But either way, you could see, in the non-Pentecostal perspective, just the prestige of being the Pope, especially when Peter was the first, Pope, according to Catholicism. So yeah. And of course, though, us in the Pentecostal, non-Catholic region don't really adhere to the Pope, and obviously that whole idea is not one we follow. But again, I just want to say that even I remember when I was Catholic, that was the idea, or at least when I was going to Catholic, church as a kid, and under my grandparents and whatnot.
Established in the era of Imperial Rome, the papacy had maintained a relatively peaceful coexistence with the Christianized barbarians in its midst after the fall of the Western Empire. Meanwhile, back in the 6th century, the Germanic Lombards had swept into Italy and conquered most of the Byzantine holdings in the peninsula. However, the Eastern emperors had managed to retain the city of Rome, and through it, political control over the papacy.
Yeah, I mentioned this in my early Christian Schisms video for, extra history, that, yeah, there are times where the papacy was just kind of under the thumb of emperors, and this isn't just with the, Byzantine era of Rome, but also at this issue kind of goes on to like the Holy Roman Empire era, kind of oversimplified, actually covered about the War of the Bucket, a funny video, but he kind of talks about that power dynamic between a kingdom versus the papacy, and at times where the Pope was and the papacy was under the thumb, but there are times where that was reversed. You know what I mean? And even in the world of religion, politics, the papacy or just religion can be used to elevate other political, secular ideas and make of that what you will. But I think a very famous one is, I think King Henry basically asking for forgiveness. I think it was from Pope Gregory. I could be wrong about the names and the event, but, one of the oldest stories I heard this when I was, a child, maybe around the ages of 4 to 6, somewhere around there. But the story of a pope, I think one of my teachers was talking about the story of a king who basically went and begged the pope to be unexcommunicated, and kind of the story I think I remember her telling is that he came barefooted and it was raining or snowing outside. Again, this was when I was 4 or 6, so I'm not sure about all this. This is just off the top of my head, but there have been events where the king had to essentially kind of kneel down, as it were, or rather submit to the papacy, especially with excommunication being a thing, and you have to kind of gain the idea with a lot of times in the public the more common outside of the game of politics and the Game of Thrones, as it were. Just how important religion was to just normal people, especially in the medieval era, where, especially back then. I mean, nowadays, I'm not saying religion isn't important, but nowadays, at least here in America and the West, religion's kind of, a lot of people say they can do without it. And, but back then, I think it really was even more integral in some ways, to people personally, the idea, especially the medieval era, are you kidding me? And so, having like a godless king, as it were, not with any backing from like, the Pope or something, could be such a big like thing that could cause a lot of issues, you know what I mean? Even in the time of like, kind of a little past the medieval era, kind of like the Napoleonic era, even Napoleon reinstating Catholicism, knowing that most of the people of France were still Catholic, even though the revolution tried to undo that, just to show. I mean, Napoleon meant it more as a political move, but it still acknowledges just the importance of it, right? And of the church in that regard, especially, yeah.
The Byzantines hoped that through the church in Rome, they could maintain spiritual and cultural primacy over the Germano-Latin West. For over 2 centuries, the Pope, for all his spiritual power, dared not defy the will of Constantinople. In fact, rarely would one become Pope in the first place without approval from the Emperor. However, this control would not last, and friction soon developed between the Empire and the Church. In 726...
Yes, Leo the Third, famous for iconoclasm. Am I pronouncing that right? Yeah, forgive me for mispronunciation. I'm always bad at it. But iconoclasm, essentially, destroying like images and icons, which is something of a big controversy, as you can tell in his reign. Something which a lot of people kind of give him a lot of flack for. And it's pointed out by a lot of people, especially people in the comments. When we did cover that, I think it was in the early Muslim expansion, something that's used against him, and obviously soured his relationship with the papacy, obviously. I mean, the thing is, once again, let me give you the Pentecostal perspective. In our church, we don't have any icons, obviously. We don't have any images, no paintings, no anything, in our church. The most we have is just Bible verses written on the walls, but that's a bit different. No statues and whatnot. So obviously I don't really believe in the idea of using icons. And I remember when my grandma was Catholic, she would take me with her to Catholic church, and she would kind of, get on her knees in front of the images of the saints, like statues, as I called them, and pray to them, and obviously in Catholicism and other denominations, icons and things of the saints are around, maybe decorating the church and whatnot, and it's a essential part. I mean, obviously now with Pentecostalism and the denomination I fall under, we don't do that. We don't have any images or icons, so I could obviously feel not even that bad about iconoclasm in a sense that, like, I'm almost like, not gunning after, oh, Leo, how could you? I'm like, well, when I started going to Pentecostalism, my family followed, and we're all Pentecostal now. And I remember one of the big changes is that, we got rid of the statues. Like, my grandma had, icons and, these kind of statues of, like, Jesus and the saints. And, we kind of removed them and, packed them up in a box. And even I was pretty, like, oh, let's remove this, image of Jesus on the wall, like, remove. I was like that. I didn't destroy them, but there came a point where even my mom was asking my grandma about why she kind of kept them. Like, we kind of removed them, but she kept them in a box. And my grandma said, she grew up with that, and that it had sentimental value of home and whatnot. And I kind of, like, understood that in a sense. So, like, again, I was pretty much, yeah, let's remove these things because I don't want us to pray to them. We ought not to pray to them or, like, have them in any part of our worship now, obviously, since we were in a new denomination. But, obviously understanding the sentimental value, we kind of kept them. I'm not sure if my grandma has kept them or removed them. That was years ago. But, and that's kind of the thing, like, at the end, it's not something I'm outraged that Leo did, because, obviously, as you can tell, my denomination, we don't use that. We don't have any images or paintings or any of that in our church, or it doesn't play a part in worship or decoration at all. But again, like, almost like I kind of do, I'm almost am detached from the thing, but also at the same time, I'm kind of like, Leo, at least for, like, a historical thing, like a historical or artistic merit, I was like, well, Leo, maybe we could have kept them around. And in a sense, this is a very complex issue. Obviously, my feelings are complex about it, but it's kind of like when the Crusaders with the Fourth Crusade just tore down all these, like, pagan images. I'm like, well, we could have kept them around for history. Like, no one is, like, worshipping them. Well, this is different. Iconoclasm, obviously, these icons are a part of the church itself, but it's a bit complicated, obviously, as you can tell. So my feelings are a bit iffy about it, kind of mixed, but either way, the main thing is that it still is a big outrage to, things, especially in Catholicism, what he did, And I know I just use a pretty broad thing, the icons of Byzantines, which you can, or, medieval era churches and onward, the icons, and I kind of threw in a lot there with, statues and all that. And again, like, it is a pretty big thing. Like, some denomination would be like, oh, I think Leo was didn't want anyone actually worshipping them, so that was a pretty big thing. Some would say they're graven images, others, obviously, like, more in line with denominations that use that, would be like, no, they're not. Again, it's a big issue. Like I said, for me, in our church, we don't have any icons, so, like, the loss of them isn't something, like, I'm, like, heads up about, but I understand that, through the perspective of others, yeah, it is a pretty big outrage and a big controversy, So yeah, these issues, man.
AD, Emperor Leo III forbade the worship of images and icons of Christ. This movement, known as iconoclasm, was vehemently opposed by the Pope and served as a watershed moment in the papacy gravitating away from Constantinople.
For over 17 years, the
In the year 751, the Lombards conquered Ravenna, the last Eastern Roman holding in the north of Italy. The fierce Germanic warriors turned their attention south and threatened to attack Rome. By now,
but then they're
the papacy
saved
had
by
become thoroughly disillusioned by the
Francia.
Byzantines, so they turned away from their Greek benefactors and looked westward for help. It is here that the Franks enter the story. As one of the many
Yes, and it's under King Pepin, I believe. It's King Pepin who saves, the papacy from the Lombards, and basically lays the foundation of the papal states as we know them, and solidifies its more breaking free from its attachment to, the Romans. So yeah, and then just a lot happens right here, you know?
Germanic tribes that had settled in Roman territory following the collapse of the West, they had quickly risen to eminence. Under the kings of the Merovingian dynasty, the Franks had come to conquer much of modern-day France and Germany, during which time they had converted to Latin Christianity. The current king of the Franks was Pepin the Short, who had deposed the last Merovingian monarch to form his own dynasty, the Carolingians. It was
I also believe Pepin's the father of Charlemagne. Wait, let me Google that. Okay, yeah, he is. I wasn't confident about that, I needed a double check. But yeah, Charlemagne, you know, basically ends up being crowned by the Pope, and this kind of adds into the whole, you know, kingdom, Holy Roman Empire, papacy situation, because, you know, the Pope is the one who crowned Charlemagne. And, yeah, it's overall a very big thing, because it kind of sets a precedent of the Pope being kind of sort of the kingmaker, you know, or emperor maker. And it's even pretty big even to like the time of Napoleon, a big part of his coronation that people talk about. The most important part is him taking the crown and putting it on himself, showing his own powers from kind of his own hand, you know? So Napoleon, it's a pretty big thing that even the event like that was almost shocking or like noteworthy, right? And that power dynamic of the Pope crowning people also played into a big part with conflicts between, you know, the secular king or emperor of the world and the Pope and the papacy.
As to Pepin, whom the Pope called for aid against the invading Lombards. King Pepin was happy to oblige, and with his army drove back the encroaching enemy. Taking his piety one step further, he declared that the strip of land from Rome to Ravenna was not to be returned to the Byzantines, but instead gifted magnanimously to the papacy, laying the foundation of the Papal States, a sovereign kingdom ruled from Rome by the Pope himself. Owing to the donation of Pepin, the Pope was now functionally the king of an independent kingdom in central Italy, albeit under Frankish purview. This was a seminal moment in the history of Christianity. From here, the papacy continued to gravitate towards the Franks for protection, and the Byzantines turned away from the Pope and towards the Patriarch in Constantinople for religious legitimacy. The rift between Eastern and Western Christianity was slowly widening. In the year 797, a fateful figure rose to power in Constantinople. She was Irene, Empress.
Yes, so Irene, a pretty big role in her, like, part is that, you know, she essentially became the empress. I think she ruled as a regent, sort of like, you know, kind of like being the real power until eventually I think she removes her son or whoever she was being regent for and just kind of like drops the pretext of like, you know, that she's not the one actually in charge. And a pretty big thing is that she actually calls an ecumenical council, again mispronouncing that word, I don't know why I always mispronounce that word, but she calls the Second Council of Nicaea, essentially, which is a pretty big thing, and it actually played a part in the ending of iconoclasm. So yeah, overall, pretty big emerging figure here.
Of the East, and one of the most powerful women in early medieval history. In truth, she had been in power for 17 years already, ruling as regent for her young son, Emperor Constantine VI. The relationship between mother and son was anything but harmonious, and the two were perpetually locked in a bitter struggle for power. In 797, Irene dropped the pretense of co-rulership and had her son's eyes gouged out, deposing him entirely and becoming sole ruler of Eastern Rome.
Yeah, that happened a lot in like medieval era. You hear about like, I've taken power, I'm gonna poke your eyes out. Like at that point, just kill me, dude. But I think the idea was that you couldn't just kill someone like that, and also it's kind of to be a more symbolic thing that look, a blind person can't rule an empire. I think that's kind of how it was supposed to kind of come across. But still brutal in its own way, you know. especially your own, like, yeah, Mama's cold-blooded, dude. um, like, you kind of have to be to play the game of politics. Like, not even family comes above that, you know?
Rule was a productive one, and her most notable act was to end the iconoclasm controversy that had plagued Constantinople for decades. In theory, this should have pleased the Pope in Rome, but in reality, the reign of the iron-willed emperors simply provided a catalyst that would further the divide between the two halves of the Christian.
Because women can't rule! You have to, like, realize that, like, yeah, back in times like this, older times, especially, like, you know, like, powerful women especially, back in history, were kind of, like, not really seen all that well, like, and there's a lot, like, I feel like sometimes historians might even, like, showcase the faults of women, who sometimes will do the same exact thing as plenty of male emperors have done, like, you know, blinding relatives, killing them, but, like, for some reason, historians will probably make it look worse for women in a weird way, or talk about it more downward, you know, like, the idea of powerful women. And I think an idea is that Irene was a woman, therefore unfit to rule, and whatnot, and I think that played a part. Especially you have to think, like, back then when, you know, women were kind of given a lot less rights and power than men, especially in comparison to nowadays. Yeah, why someone like this would kind of be, like, seen a bit, like, iffy by men in power, you know what I mean? So, yeah.
World. In the West, the rising star known as Charlemagne was proving to be a champion.
Charlemagne. But, yeah, Charlemagne, you know, credited as the first Holy Roman Empire, or at least, like, the forebearer of that, you know. Funny thing is, I actually read a book a while, like, before I graduated with my bachelor's in English, my last semester, we actually read a book called The Non-Existent Knight, featuring Charlemagne. Like, you know, Charlemagne, actually, I learned in that class, has a lot of, like, legends, almost like Arthurian in a sense, about him and his reign, which was interesting, because we know he's a real guy, we know in history, you know, like, but there's a lot of mythology also around him, and also in literature. So, like, it was interesting reading about him, you know, in that novel, as he's a character in it. But obviously, the events are fictional, because there's a knight who doesn't have a body, he's just a suit of armor. You know what I mean? So yeah, a very big player, especially in helping kind of solidify, you know, yeah, the already great divide between East and West with the Holy Roman Empire and whatnot, and being crowned Emperor of the West and all that.
Champion of Christianity. The kings of the Franks had conquered the Saxons and the Avars, introducing these pagan peoples to the faith of the Roman Church. While conquering Italy, Charlemagne had taken territory in the south at the expense of Constantinople, but had adhered to the will of his father, King Pepin, and respected the sovereignty of the Pope's domain. Needless to say, the ambitious warlord was quickly becoming a favorite of the papacy. In the winter of 800 AD, Pope Leo III invited Charlemagne to Rome, and on Christmas Day crowned him as Augustus, Emperor of Rome. It was a mutually beneficial agreement. With support from the Pope, the newly christened emperor gained spiritual legitimacy to rule his large, multi-ethnic domain, while the Pope gained a powerful protector against any threat to his religious and temporal interests. There was, however, a small hiccup in this plan. Ever since the fall of the Old Western Empire, the emperors in Constantinople had been the only sovereigns in Christendom with the legitimacy to style themselves as Roman emperors. Their sole ownership of this prestigious title remained unchallenged by the barbarian kings of the West for 300 years. Now, however, there was no emperor in Constantinople, but an empress. The Pope argued that, as women were unfit to rule, the position of Roman Emperor was technically vacant.
Therefore, I can make one, like, you know. Again, loopholes. Don't you love loopholes, guys? And yeah, that's interesting.
Gave his champion Charlemagne every right to claim a title that was currently not in use. Naturally, this development infuriated Empress Irene, but there was not much she could do to exert her power over the West, while struggling to maintain her own empire's borders against the encroachments of Bulgars and raiding Arabs. Allegedly, she tried to enter into a marriage alliance with Charlemagne to preserve her prestige, but this was foiled by Aetios, her favoured eunuch advisor, who derailed the union in a bid to maintain his power in court. In 802, Irene was deposed by the nobles of Constantinople and exiled to Lesbos. She was replaced by Nikephoros. Naturally, neither the papacy or the Frankish king relinquished their claim on the imperial title following this development, and for the first time since antiquity, there were two Roman emperors once more. The Holy Roman Empire, a nation that would endure for another 1,000 years.
You are neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. I'm sorry, I always feel like I have to say that famous quote every time the Holy Roman Empire comes across. And in later videos, I always kind of make fun of the Holy Roman Empire, like the wannabe Rome. I've called it in the past wannabe Rome. The wannabe Roman Empire, the fake Roman Empire. You know, obviously a little disrespectful, all things considered. But though I do fall under the idea that, yeah, it ain't... This is the Roman Empire, the, you know, the Byzantines, as it were. It's literally the other part of the empire that never fell, but you know, that's just how I feel. So yeah.
Existed forevermore an indignation to the emperors of Constantinople. In function, Charlemagne's coronation was the death blow to any hopes of political unity between the two halves of Christendom. Although the Eastern and Western empires were now separated secularly, in theory, the church they both adhered to was still one united body, with the Pope in Rome as its ultimate authority. In practice, however, political interference between the Frankish and Greek emperors often caused disharmony in religious affairs. In 863,
okay, I think, yeah, he's gonna talk about the Photian Schism, which is essentially, you know, an idea that the emperor have a right to kind of, you know, appoint or I think depose the patriarch of Constantinople and whatnot without the papacy approving of such a move. And if I'm remembering correctly, it essentially ends with the Pope reluctantly like acknowledging or recognizing who the emperor appointed as the patriarch, but it was another source of tension between the Pope and, you know, the emperor and whatnot.
A political rift, known as the Photian controversy, erupted over the right of the Eastern Roman Emperor to depose and appoint the ecclesiastical patriarch of Constantinople without the approval of the Pope. After all, the Pope was the highest Christian authority, and church positions could not be interfered with without his input. This event ended in a tenuous compromise, with the Pope recognizing the Emperor's chosen patriarch, and the Emperor paying lip service to the Pope. Despite this, the illusion of unity continued to weaken, and soon, the last ecclesiastical tether feebly holding together the Christian world would finally snap. Over the centuries, Eastern and Western church rituals had developed slight deviations from one another. The Latin rite used unleavened bread to represent the body of Christ, while the Greeks used yeast-risen bread in their Eucharist. The Latins adopted filioque, the theological belief that God the Son had a role in the procession of God the Holy Spirit, while the Greeks rejected this interpretation of the Trinity, believing the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father alone.
So yeah, again, we talked about the Trinity in my other video about the early Christian schisms, and I defined it as basically as I could, you know, God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and forgot exactly what I said there, but either way, whatever I said, someone's gonna disagree with, because the Trinity is a big point of debate, and depending on what denomination you are, however you defined it, there will be someone to tell you you're wrong, or that's not how they see it. It is a thing that I don't think the world will ever fully agree on. And again, I'm in the oneness Pentecostal. We don't even adhere to the Trinity at all. Just, Jesus as God. And again, it's just something. And not that these issues are small, but like the thing is, what causes like division and branches of breaking in denominations can sometimes just be caused by the smallest things. Like, even in Pentecostals, there are many different types of Pentecostals, some splintering away. Like, we're under the UPCI, that's the Pentecostal Apostolic denomination. I fall under that, with like kind of the leader being David Bernard, I believe. And so that's a whole thing, but there are other branches of Pentecostalism, some within us, but like that there's an idea, whether it just be the way we want to run a service or the way we want to worship. And you've even heard of some Pentecostals or some church denominations that let snakes bite you. We don't do that. I would never allow a snake to bite me personally, but obviously that's the way they go about it. And like sometimes small issues and small little ways of seeing things and viewing things can just lead to just so much division. Not to say that these are small issues, mind you, but obviously, it's kind of amazing that in one way, whatever I say, which is right to me, will be wrong to someone else, and in a way that you could say something that will be wrong to me, but right to, like, it's amazing. In a way, you could almost say something, and it'll always be right to someone and wrong to someone else. I mean, granted, there are plenty of issues like that secularly, but especially prevalent in the church, or there'll be some overlap, and there'll be some disagreement. It's wild, really, when you really get into the nitty-gritty of looking at things, just how it goes, man. It's never ending, to be honest. And it never will be, to be honest, until the Lord Jesus come back. He's coming back soon. Yes.
Previously, the two churches had more or less tolerated each other's practices. This changed at the turn of the millennium, when the Normans ventured down into southern Italy. The Latin-speaking knights conquered the Eastern Roman holdings in Apulia and ingratiated themselves with the Pope, who saw in them an opportunity for political gain. Having formerly been Byzantine-run, the churches in the Normans' new territory practiced the Greek rites. In 1053, the papacy declared that these churches had to convert to the Latin rite or be forced to close. The ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople was thoroughly enraged by this, and in retaliation ordered the closure of all Latin churches in the eastern capital. To deal with what was quickly becoming a diplomatic crisis, the Pope sent Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida to Constantinople, who, on July 16, 1054, laid a letter of excommunication to the Patriarch on the altar of the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Eastern Christendom. This was
talk about a big move, right? Like, obviously, through Constantinople, the biggest slap in the face you could do. I'm telling you, like, just looking at church politics, I coined the term in the early Christian Schism, by Extra History, Christian Game of Thrones, and that's kind of what a lot of these early church schisms, and even here, it really is the schisms I jokingly now call the Christian Game of Thrones. Like the politics, the maneuvering, the things, I think you could just make a show and it will be like up there with Game of Thrones in terms of like intrigue. Because me personally, I actually like Game of Thrones when a lot of people liked it with the whole dragon stuff and the big battles and ice walkers. I think Game of Thrones was at its best when it was mainly just the political maneuvering and chess playing, and just characters having to deal with other characters, and like Tywin Lannister just being a G, you know, being the best character of that series. I don't know, I'm sorry, I don't mean to complete derail, but I think you could honestly just make a show about the great schisms, many schisms of Christianity, and you can just call it Christian Game of Thrones. And you can get the same effect, you know?
Most extreme insult the Latins could possibly have delivered. In response, the Patriarch and Emperor Constantine IX excommunicated Umber and his legates in turn, and officially divorced themselves from the ecclesiastical authority of the Pope in Rome. This was the final schism. Eastern and Western Christianity were officially and totally severed, while the Latin and Greek worlds had never been more divided. The chroniclers of the High Middle Ages described their religious counterparts with unflattering prose. Eastern authors imagined the hardy lands of Western Europe producing only the most brutish, backwards and warlike of barbarians. Western chroniclers described the wealthy lands of Byzantium as full of hedonistic, two-timing, no-good schemers, while both sides described the other as schismatic heretics. With that said, relations between the two peoples after the Great Schism were often cordial as well. At the beginning of the 12th century, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily had become a unique specimen of a realm where Byzantine Greeks and Northern Latins lived side by side in relative harmony. It is important to note that the common folk were rarely affected by the feuding of popes, patriarchs and emperors, and lived peaceful lives unaffected by ecclesiastical or political conflict. With that said, the turn of the 13th century would see a deterioration of these public relations. By the late 1100s, there existed a well-established community of Italian merchants within the walls of Constantinople, primarily from the republics of Genoa, Pisa and Venice. While these Latin traders lived amicably among the Greeks for a time, relations quickly began to deteriorate. The locals began to resent the fact that the Italians had a near-total monopoly on sea-bound trade and were accumulating vast land estates at the expense of the natives. With their economic livelihood imposed upon, the Greeks took...
Yeah, we covered this tension in the Fourth Crusade series by Kings and Generals, and obviously, you know, especially when the Latin Westerners came and basically sacked Constantinople, one of the worst atrocities of all time. Like, that hurt my soul, seeing Constantinople get jumped like that, and it never recovered from that. But yeah, that series did cover about the tension between the Greek speakers and the Latin speakers, and just like how wild everything went. And also it even continues on to like the Rise of the Ottoman series, which we covered last time. I think that was the last long series I covered a while back. And you know, even the last Roman emperors basically... It was big because the last Roman emperors literally went to the Pope asking for aid and basically, you know, subjecting themselves to the authority of the papacy, which just kind of goes to show you the dire straits that the Byzantine Romans were at, right, these emperors, and that was a big source of people and even Constantinople being angry at the emperor for doing that. So yeah, again...
Dredging up old religious rhetoric, making a row about the Latin status as traitors to their church. In 1182, tensions boiled into a riot, and an angry mob of Constantinople's population stormed into the city's Latin quarter, massacring the Italian population in a racially motivated pogrom. This event led many in Latin Christendom, who already saw the Eastern Romans as troublesome heretics, to now label them as blatant enemies of the West. In the year 1204, a Latin crusade, headed originally for Egypt, was diverted to Constantinople at the behest of an exiled Byzantine prince, who promised them riches in return for their help in reclaiming his rightful throne. The grim end of this tale is already well known to many, and we have covered it in a previous video. Suffice to say, when debts were not paid and diplomacy crumbled, the Latin Crusaders committed one of the worst human atrocities in medieval history. Remembering the massacre of their countrymen 20 years earlier, the Crusaders raped, looted, and slaughtered the innocent people of Constantinople for 3 days before dividing the Byzantine Empire among themselves. The sack of Constantinople was ultimately the culmination of centuries of deteriorating relations. From that point on, any hope of reconciliation between the two branches of Christianity was dead in the water. In the centuries that followed, the two schismatic churches that had dominated medieval politics turned their attention away from each other. In the east, the Byzantines would later reclaim their capital, but tired and broken, they were conquered by the rising Ottoman juggernaut.
Yeah, that sack, it's often been speculated that the Byzantines could have held out longer if they had never been like sacked like that. That they never fully recovered, even though the empire was restored, they never fully recovered from that loss, and that weakened them greatly to the Ottomans. I mean, I don't know how long they could have lasted for sure, but there are a lot of people who speculate probably a lot longer. If that had never taken place, but who knows? Who knows?
And the center of the Orthodox Church moved north to Moscow. Turkish domination was a fate many Eastern Christians accepted duly, for relatively tame Muslim overlordship of the time was surely better than the atrocities of Latin rule. In the West, reformations were the order of the day.
Martin Luther, 95 Thesis, Protestantism, and all that. I actually plan on doing a video on my other channel, Edwin de Jesus, about the history of how Pentecostalism came about, and there is a long line that stretches even back to the days of Martin Luther, so overall, I have a pretty positive view of the man, and again, depending on what denomination you're in and what's not, that might change. Just, you know, overall, I do really like Martin Luther.
As the Protestant movement gained traction, and the Catholic Church found itself rocked to its foundations. In time, Western Europe was too busy tearing itself apart in a revolutionary fervor to concern itself with the Christians of the East. To this day, the Catholic and Orthodox churches remain separated from one another, and while modern relations are cordial, it can be safely assumed that they will forever remain two culturally, linguistically, and politically distinct branches of Christianity. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed.
So yeah, guys, that's the end of my 2-part release about theology on this channel. This video and the extra history, early Christian schisms. I personally enjoy this. This might be the only time on this channel's history where I go into a subjects knowing what I'm talking about and can give a lot of info and insight, even if it is through a different perspective, that religious perspective that you might share, you know, denominations and all that. But again, I have my other channel for this, Edwin de Jesus. If you want to see this side of me in other places, by all means go there. Please don't recommend any more theology, at least on this channel. The other channel is free game, but for this channel I want to just mainly focus on secular, you know what I mean? Want to focus on, you know, secular history, now not going fully in depth about religion. So that's the only request I would ever ask of you on this channel, and with recommendations, please. But overall, yeah, it was nice to actually kind of come into a video knowing what I'm talking about and being able to give things, because most of the time in secular history, I'll have a general idea of something, but I obviously won't know many details, and whatnot. So this will be probably the only time in this channel's history where I kind of knew what I was talking about, or at least had more to give and information to share. Well, guys, that's the end of that.